On a Tuesday morning in September of 1979, a boy named Silas Bontrager stood at the edge of a gravel driveway in Hardin County, Iowa, and watched a man he had known for less than 3 months sign over the title to a 1962 John Deere 4010 tractor to him. Silas was 17 years old. He had no parents, no siblings, no relatives anyone had been able to locate. He had a duffel bag with 4 shirts in it, a pair of work boots that were one size too large, and exactly $11 in his front pocket. The man signing the title was 61 years old, had farmed the same 480 acres in Hardin County for 38 years, and had never in his adult life done anything that could reasonably be described as impulsive. His name was Emmett Hassel, and the reason this story is still being told is not because of what Emmett gave away that morning. It is because of what Silas Bontrager did with it. Let me tell you about Hardin County in 1979, because you need to understand the place before you can understand either of these men. Hardin County sits in the north-central part of Iowa, flat as a table and rich as any ground on the continent. The soil there is black and deep, the kind of black that looks wet even when it hasn't rained in 2 weeks, the kind of deep that farmers in other states drive hours just to stand on and feel under their boots. Corn was the language of Hardin County. Not a metaphor for the language. The language. When men met at the co-op in Eldora on a Friday morning, they did not ask each other how they were doing. They asked each other what they were running per acre, what the moisture was coming out of the combine, whether the elevator was docking them on test weight. A man's identity in Hardin County in 1979 was not his name or his church or even his family. It was his land and what he pulled out of it. Emmett Hassel had been pulling 140 bushels per acre out of his ground for most of the 1970s, which was not spectacular, but was steady and reliable and honest, and in Hardin County, Iowa, steady and reliable and honest was about the highest compliment you could give a farmer. Let me tell you about Emmett Hassel, because you need to understand the man before you can understand what he did. Emmett was born in 1918, on the same farm he would eventually farm himself, the son of a German immigrant who had broken the original sod in 1904 and never looked back. His father, Heinrich Hassel, had arrived in America with $40 and a belief that the ground did not lie to you if you paid attention to it, and he had passed that belief to Emmett the way other fathers passed on pocket watches or last names. Emmett had farmed through the Depression as a teenager, through the war years as a young man, through the boom years of the 1950s and the volatile years of the 1960s and the inflationary spiral of the 1970s. And through all of it, he had never borrowed more than he could repay in 2 years, never planted more than his equipment could handle, and never, not once, walked away from a piece of ground that needed something from him. He was a compact, quiet man, the kind of man who wore the same canvas jacket for 20 years, not because he couldn't afford a new one, but because the old one fit right and he didn't see the point. His wife, Mabel, had died in 1971 of a stroke, and after that Emmett farmed alone, which in Hardin County in the 1970s was unusual but not unheard of, and which Emmett managed by being more organized than most men with hired help. The 1962 John Deere 4010 had been his primary tractor since he bought it new from the dealer in Iowa Falls. He had paid $4,200 for it, which in 1962 was a serious sum of money, and he had maintained it with the same attention he gave everything else he owned, which meant it ran in 1979 as well as it had run in 1963, maybe better, because Emmett had learned its particular habits and tolerances over 17 years and had adjusted accordingly. By 1979, he had also acquired a newer 4430, which had more horsepower and was better suited to the larger implement widths he was running, and the 4010 had become what farmers in that part of Iowa called a utility tractor, meaning it did the jobs that didn't require raw power, but required reliability and availability. Emmett used it to run the loader, to pull the grain cart, to power the auger. It was not obsolete. It was not a museum piece. It was a working machine that happened to be 17 years old and that Emmett knew as well as he knew his own hands. Silas Bontrager had arrived in Hardin County in June of 1979, the way a lot of troubled young men arrived in rural Iowa in those years, which is to say, by accident and necessity and without a plan. He had been in the foster system in Des Moines since he was 9 years old, had aged out of it at 17, and had gotten on a Greyhound bus with his duffel bag and his $11 and ridden it as far as the $11 would take him, which turned out to be Eldora, Iowa, the county seat of Hardin County, population approximately 3,000. He had gotten off the bus because the driver had told him this was as far as his ticket went, and he had stood on the sidewalk in front of the Eldora bus stop and looked at a town that appeared to have more grain elevators than traffic lights, and decided that this was as good a place as any to figure out what came next. What came next was that he walked into a diner on the main street and asked if they needed a dishwasher, and the woman behind the counter, whose name was Lorraine Webb and who had been running that diner for 19 years, looked at him for about 4 seconds and said yes. And that was how Silas Bontrager came to be in Hardin County, Iowa, in the summer of 1979. Emmett Hassel ate breakfast at Lorraine's Diner every Tuesday and Thursday morning. He had been doing this since 1972, after Mabel died, because he had discovered that cooking for one was something he was willing to do for dinner, but not for breakfast, and because Lorraine's coffee was better than his. He noticed Silas the second week, not because Silas did anything remarkable, but because Emmett noticed everything, and a 17-year-old boy washing dishes alone at 6 in the morning had a particular quality of aloneness that Emmett recognized from somewhere deep in his own experience. He didn't say anything the second week. He didn't say anything the third week either. On the fourth week, he asked Lorraine about the boy, and Lorraine told him what she knew, which was most of what I just told you. And Emmett sat with his coffee for a while and then went back to eating his eggs. What happened next is the kind of thing that is difficult to explain to people who did not grow up in rural Iowa in that era, because it did not involve a conversation or a decision in any formal sense. It involved Emmett finishing his breakfast, leaving his usual tip, walking out to the parking lot, and then walking back inside and asking Lorraine if the boy could be spared for a few hours on Saturday morning. Lorraine said she supposed so. Emmett came back on Saturday morning and asked Silas if he knew anything about machinery, and Silas said not much, and Emmett said that was fine and told him to get in the truck. They drove out to the farm in silence, which was not an uncomfortable silence, but the silence of two people who were still deciding what the other one was. Emmett showed Silas the shop, the equipment, the layout of the place. He showed him how to grease the fittings on the 4010, how to check the hydraulic fluid, how to adjust the fan belt. Silas was quiet and attentive and did not ask unnecessary questions, which Emmett noted. He brought him back to town at noon. He came back the following Saturday and did the same thing. By the end of August, Silas was spending every Saturday at Emmett's farm, and some Sundays, and a few evenings during the week. He had learned to operate the 4010, which Emmett had taught him with the same methodical patience he applied to everything. starting with the basics of the hydraulic system and working forward to the specific feel of the clutch and the particular sound the engine made when it was working at the right load. Silas had a mechanical aptitude that surprised Emmett, not because Emmett had expected the boy to be dull, but because the aptitude was intuitive in a way that usually took years to develop. He could feel when something was wrong before the gauges showed it. He could hear a bearing beginning to fail 2 weeks before it needed to be replaced. Emmett did not say much about this, because he was not a man who gave compliments easily, but he noticed it and filed it away. Let me tell you about the morning of September 11, 1979, because it is the morning this story turns on and you need to understand exactly what happened. Emmett had been thinking about the 4010 for several weeks. He had the 4430 for the heavy work, and the 4010 had become redundant in a way that was costing him money in insurance and maintenance without giving him proportional return. He had thought about selling it, had even called the dealer in Iowa Falls who had offered him $3,200 for it, which was fair. But he had also been thinking about Silas, specifically about what Silas was going to do when winter came and the diner slowed down and the boy had no place to live that wasn't a rented room above the hardware store on Main Street that cost him $60 a month and had no heat worth mentioning. Emmett was not a sentimental man. He was not given to gestures. But he had watched Silas Bontrager operate that 4010 for 2 months, and he had seen something in the boy that he did not have a precise word for, but that he recognized as the thing that separated farmers who lasted from farmers who didn't. It was not ambition exactly, and it was not toughness exactly. It was more like a willingness to be honest with the ground, to accept what the ground told you without argument, to give the work what it required and not try to shortchange it. Heinrich Hassel had it. Emmett had it. He had not expected to see it in a 17-year-old boy from Des Moines who had never farmed a day in his life. But there it was. He called the dealer in Iowa Falls and told him he wasn't selling the tractor after all. Then he called the county courthouse and asked about the process for transferring a vehicle title, because in Iowa a tractor is titled like a vehicle, and the woman at the courthouse told him what he needed to do. He did it. On the morning of September 11, 1979, he drove to town, picked Silas up at the hardware store, drove him out to the farm, and handed him the title to the 1962 John Deere 4010 in the gravel driveway next to the machine shed. Silas stood there, looking at the piece of paper for a long moment without saying anything. Then he looked up at Emmett and said, "Why?" Emmett said, "Because you're going to need it." Silas said he couldn't pay for it, and Emmett said he knew that, and Silas said he didn't understand, and Emmett said, "You will." That was the entire conversation. Emmett went inside to make coffee. Silas stood in the driveway holding the title for another few minutes, and then he went into the shop and checked the oil on the tractor, because that was the kind of thing you did when someone handed you something you didn't have words for. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. How many times in your life has someone given you something they didn't have to give? Something that cost them real money and real thought, with no expectation of return, and no explanation beyond the idea that you were going to need it? Not many times, probably. Maybe once. Maybe never. Emmett Hassel gave that tractor to Silas Bontrager in September of 1979, and he never asked for anything back, and he never mentioned it again. And for the next several years, as far as most people in Hardin County knew, it was just a story about an old farmer who had given away a tractor to some kid from nowhere. Which is one way to tell the story. It is not the most accurate way. Let me tell you about what Silas Bontrager did between 1979 and 1984, because those 5 years are the foundation of everything that comes after. He kept working at the diner through the winter of 1979, saving money with a discipline that Lorraine Webb found remarkable and slightly alarming. He asked Emmett if he could keep the tractor in the machine shed until spring, and Emmett said yes. In the spring of 1980, Silas rented 40 acres from a retired farmer named Clarence Peterson, who had land east of Eldora that he wasn't using and didn't want to sell, and he planted it in corn using the 4010 and a 2-row planter he had bought at a farm auction for $220. He did not make money that first year. He made enough to cover his rent and his seed and his fuel, and a little toward the loan he had taken from the Hardin County State Bank for the planter and the other small implements he needed, and he put the rest back into the operation. He was 18 years old, and he was farming 40 acres alone with a 17-year-old tractor and second-hand equipment, and he was doing it correctly, which in Hardin County, Iowa, in 1980, was not a small thing. Emmett watched all of this from a distance, which was his way. He did not offer advice unless Silas asked, and Silas asked regularly, which Emmett respected. The questions Silas asked were not the questions of a beginner. They were the questions of someone who had already thought the problem through and wanted to check his reasoning against someone who had been doing it longer. By 1982, Silas had expanded to 80 acres, had paid off the planter loan, and had bought a used combine, a 1968 John Deere 55, from an estate sale in Franklin County for $1,400. He had rebuilt the feeder house himself over the winter, using a manual he had ordered from a John Deere parts dealer in Waterloo and a set of tools he had accumulated one at a time over 3 years. The combine ran. It ran because Silas had made it run, and it ran because the 4010 had given him the credibility to rent the land that gave him the income that let him buy it. By 1984, Silas was farming 160 acres, had 2 employees during planting and harvest, and had put a down payment on a small house on the edge of Eldora. He was 22 years old. He was not wealthy. He was not even comfortable in any conventional sense. But he was established, which in Hardin County meant something specific and important, and the people who had watched him start with nothing and a borrowed machine shed were paying attention in a way that rural communities pay attention to things that confirm what they want to believe about hard work and the land. Let me tell you about the years between 1984 and 2001, because they are the years that tested everything Silas had built, and the years that proved whether the thing Emmett had seen in him in 1979 was real. The 1980s farm crisis hit Hardin County the way it hit most of the Midwest, which is to say badly and without much warning for the people who had borrowed heavily against inflated land values. Silas had not borrowed heavily. He had borrowed carefully, the way Emmett had taught him by example, never more than he could repay in 2 years, never against land values he didn't believe would hold. He lost some ground when the rents went up and some neighbors sold out to larger operations, but he did not lose the core of what he had built. By 1990, he was farming 240 acres. By 1995, he was farming 380. He had married a woman named Helen Donnelly in 1987, and they had 3 sons, born in 1988, 1991, and 1994. The boys grew up on the farm the way farm boys do, which is to say they were on equipment before they were in school, and they knew the difference between a hydraulic leak and an oil leak before they knew long division. Emmett Hassel had watched all of this from his own farm, which he was still operating into the late 1980s, though by then he had scaled back to the ground he could manage alone and had rented out the rest. He and Silas had developed a friendship over the years that had the particular quality of friendships between men of very different ages who respect each other without needing to say so, which meant they talked about equipment and weather and crop prices and almost never talked about anything personal. Emmett came to Silas's wedding. He came to the hospital when each of the three boys was born. He did not make speeches or offer toasts. He showed up, which was his version of devotion. In 1997, Emmett Hassel had a stroke. It was not fatal, but it was serious, and it left him with a weakness on his left side that made operating equipment dangerous and living alone impractical. His daughter, a woman named Patricia, who lived in Cedar Rapids and had not farmed a day in her life, came and helped him arrange the sale of the farm equipment and the rental of the land to a neighbor, and Emmett moved into an assisted living facility in Eldora that was clean and well run, and that Emmett tolerated because he did not have the energy to argue about it. Silas visited him every week. He brought the boys when they were old enough to sit still for an hour, and Emmett talked to them about the farm and the equipment and the principles that had governed his working life, and the boys listened with varying degrees of attention depending on their ages. But they listened. The 1962 John Deere 4010 was still running. Was still. Silas had maintained it with the same care Emmett had taught him, and it had become on his farm what it had been on Emmett's farm in its later years. A utility tractor, reliable and available and known, the kind of machine you could count on for the jobs that didn't require power but required trust. His oldest son, a boy named Aaron, had learned to drive on it at age 9, the same way Silas had learned on it at 17, and had developed the same instinctive feel for its particular habits that Silas had developed over 2 decades of operation. The tractor was now 37 years old. It had been rebuilt twice, the engine once and the hydraulic system once, both times by Silas, both times using original John Deere parts sourced from dealers across 3 states. It did not look new. It looked like what it was, which was a machine that had been used hard and maintained faithfully, and that had given back what it had been given. Emmett Hassel died in February of 2001. He was 82 years old. He had lived long enough to see Silas Bontrager become the kind of farmer that Hardin County pointed to when it wanted to explain what it meant to do the work correctly, and this had given him a satisfaction that he had never expressed in words, but that everyone who knew him could see in the way he talked about Silas when Silas wasn't in the room. The funeral was held at the Lutheran Church in Eldora, and the attendance was larger than most people expected, because Emmett had been quiet enough in his later years that people had half forgotten how many of them he had helped in ways they hadn't fully acknowledged at the time. Silas sat in the second row with Helen and the 3 boys. He did not speak at the service. After the burial, he drove back to the farm and went into the shop and stood next to the 4010 for a while without doing anything in particular, and then he checked the oil, because that was the kind of thing you did. Let me tell you about the years between 2001 and 2018, because they are the years that complete the shape of this story. Silas Bontrager continued to farm. He expanded to 520 acres by 2005, to 640 by 2010, and to just over 800 by 2015, which in Hardin County was a substantial operation but not a corporate one, still a family farm in the original sense of the term, meaning that the family worked it and made the decisions and bore the consequences. Aaron, the oldest son, came back to the farm after 2 years of agricultural studies at Iowa State and became Silas's full partner in the operation. The second son, Jonah, had gone into engineering and was living in Minneapolis, and the third son, Micah, had taken a different path entirely and was teaching high school agriculture in a town called Hampton, 12 miles south of Eldora. Silas did not have opinions about what his sons chose to do with their lives. He had opinions about whether they did it with integrity, and all three of them did, which was enough for him. The farm had grown, and the equipment had grown with it. There were two modern John Deere row crop tractors now, a 2015 8 370R and a 2012 7 230R, both with GPS guidance and precision planting systems and cab comforts that would have been incomprehensible to Emmett Hassel. There was a 2014 S67 combine that cost more than the entire farm had been worth when Silas started. There were planters and tillage tools and grain carts and augers and all the infrastructure of a modern corn and soybean operation, and there was still, in the corner of the main machine shed, the 1962 John Deere 4010, which Silas kept running not because he needed it, but because he was not capable of not keeping it running, and because Aaron had asked him once, when he was about 12, whether they were ever going to sell it, and Silas had said no in a tone that closed the subject permanently. Now, let me tell you about the spring of 2018, because that is where this story arrives at the thing it has been building toward since a Tuesday morning in September of 1979. Silas was 56 years old. He had been farming for 38 years, which was exactly as long as Emmett Hassel had been farming when he signed over that title in the gravel driveway. Aaron was 30 years old and had been farming alongside his father for 8 years. The operation was solid, the equipment was current, and the land was in better condition than it had been when Silas first rented it, because Silas had farmed it the way Emmett had farmed his ground, which was to say with the understanding that you were borrowing it from the next generation and were obligated to return it improved. In April of 2018, a young man came to the farm. His name was Tobias Marquez, and he was 19 years old, and he had come to Hardin County from a group home in Waterloo, Iowa, for reasons that were not entirely different from the reasons Silas Bontrager had come to Hardin County from Des Moines in 1979. He had heard about work in the area from someone at the group home who had a cousin who had worked a harvest season in Eldora, and he had taken a bus and then a ride from a truck driver and had ended up at the co-op in Eldora asking if anyone needed help, and the man behind the counter at the co-op, who had known Silas Bontrager for 30 years, had called Silas and told him there was a young man there who needed work and who reminded him a little of someone, and Silas had said to send him out. Let me tell you about Tobias Marquez because you need to understand him before you can understand what happened next. He was 19 years old, which is to say he was 2 years older than Silas had been in 1979, and he had the same quality of aloneness that Silas had had, the particular aloneness of someone who has never had a stable place in the world and has learned to be careful about needing one. He was not a big person, was lean and quick, and had hands that were already calloused in the way of someone who had done physical work since he was old enough to be useful. He did not have mechanical experience in any formal sense, but he had the same instinctive attentiveness to physical systems that Silas had recognized in himself at 17, the ability to watch something work and understand its logic without being told. Silas noticed this in the first week, the same way Emmett had noticed it in Silas, and he filed it away the same way Emmett had filed things away, without comment and without sentiment. Tobias worked through the planting season and into the summer, doing the utility work, running the grain cart, helping with the loader, learning the equipment with a speed that Aaron noted and mentioned to Silas one evening after dinner. Silas said he knew. Aaron asked what they were going to do about it. Silas said he was thinking about it. Helen, who was sitting at the kitchen table with a cup of coffee, said she thought Silas already knew what he was going to do about it and was just taking his time getting there. And Silas did not disagree with this. The harvest of 2018 was a good one. Corn came in at 187 bushels per acre across the operation, soybeans at 54, and the weather cooperated from August through October in a way that Hardin County hadn't seen in several years. Tobias ran the grain cart through the entire harvest without a significant mistake, and with an efficiency that Aaron said was better than some of the seasonal help they'd had for years. On the last day of harvest, the first week of October, Silas told Tobias to come to the shop after they had finished cleaning the combine. What Silas had in the shop, arranged in a row in the main bay, were 3 tractors. Not the 837OR and the 723OR, which were in the other bay. These were 3 older machines, each one restored to running condition, each one with a history that Silas could recite from memory. The first was the 1962 John Deere 401O, which needed no introduction. The second was a 1958 Farmhouse 560 that Silas had bought at an estate sale in 2003 and restored over 2 winters, a tractor that had been the primary machine on a 200-acre farm in Franklin County for 20 years, and that ran with a solidity that newer machines sometimes didn't match. The third was a 1971 John Deere 402O, which was the tractor that most farmers of a certain age in the Midwest considered the best all-around farm tractor ever built, and which Silas had acquired in 2009 from a retiring farmer in Bremer County, and maintained since then as a working machine, rather than a showpiece. Tobias stood in the doorway of the shop and looked at the 3 tractors without saying anything. Silas stood beside him. Aaron was somewhere behind them, pretending to organize a toolbox. Silas let the silence go for a while, the way Emmett had always let silences go, and then he said, "I want to tell you something about these 3 machines." Tobias said, "Okay." Silas said, "The first one, the 4010, was given to me when I was 17 years old by a man named Emmett Hassel, who had farmed this county for 38 years, and who gave it to me because he thought I was going to need it. I had nothing. I had a duffel bag and $11 and a job washing dishes. He gave me that tractor, and I farmed my first 40 acres with it, and I've kept it running for 39 years, because I'm not capable of not keeping it running." Tobias looked at the 4010 for a moment, and then looked back at Silas. Silas said, "The other 2 I bought and restored myself, because I learned from Emmett that old machines that have been maintained correctly are worth more than their age suggests, and because I wanted to have something to give." There was a pause. Tobias said, "Give to who?" Silas said, "To someone who was going to need it." He looked at Tobias for a moment, and then he said, "I've been watching you since April. You have the thing. I don't know what to call it. Emmett never told me what to call it either. But you have it, and I've been watching for it for a long time, and it doesn't come along as often as you'd think." He reached into the breast pocket of his canvas jacket and took out 3 folded pieces of paper and held them out to Tobias. Tobias took them. They were the titles to the 3 tractors. Silas said, "The 4010 is the one you need to understand first, because it will teach you patience. The 560 will teach you about power and how to use it without wasting it. The 402O will teach you about balance. You'll understand what I mean when you've been running them for a while." Tobias stood there, holding the 3 titles the way Silas had stood in a gravel driveway in 1979, holding 1 title. And he said the same thing Silas had said, which was why. And Silas said the same thing Emmett had said, which was because you're going to need them. And Tobias said he couldn't pay for them. And Silas said he knew that. And Tobias said he didn't understand. And Silas said, "You will." Aaron, at the toolbox, stopped pretending to organize it. Now, let me pause here and ask you something. There is a version of this story that is about tractors, about old machines, and their value and the wisdom of maintaining what others would discard. That version is true as far as it goes. But the story is not really about tractors. The tractors are the visible part of something that doesn't have a simple name. Something about what it means to see potential in a person that the person cannot yet see in themselves, and to give them the tool that makes the potential real, and to ask nothing back except that they do the same thing when the time comes. Emmett Hassel saw it in Silas Bontrager in the summer of 1979. Silas Bontrager saw it in Tobias Marquez in the spring of 2018. The tractor was not the gift. The tractor was the proof that the gift was real. Let me tell you about what Tobias Marquez did with 3 tractors, because the story does not end in a machine shed in October of 2018. Silas had offered him the use of a small equipment shed on the south end of the property, and the use of 40 acres of ground that Silas owned outright and had been cash rented to a neighbor for a modest return. The terms were the same terms Emmett had offered Silas, which is to say there were no formal terms, only the understanding that the ground would be farmed correctly and the equipment would be maintained correctly and that anything else could be figured out as they went. Tobias accepted this with the same quiet seriousness with which Silas had accepted it 39 years earlier. The spring of 2019 was cold and wet, the kind of spring that tests new farmers in ways that experienced ones have already learned to navigate. Tobias planted his 40 acres in corn 2 weeks later than the agronomists recommended, because the ground was too wet to work correctly before that, and he had learned from watching Silas that the calendar was a suggestion and the soil was the authority. He was right to wait. The neighbors who had planted on schedule into wet ground had compaction problems all season. Tobias's ground was clean. He came in at 172 bushels per acre, which was below the county average for that year, but above what most of the early planted fields around him produced, and which was, for a first-year farmer on 40 acres, with 3 used tractors and a rented planter, a number that several people in Eldora found worth talking about. He had run all 3 tractors through that first season, learning their individual characters the way Silas had said he would, and finding that Silas had been right about what each one taught. The 4010 required patience in a literal mechanical sense, because its hydraulic system responded more slowly than modern equipment and punished anyone who tried to rush it. The 560 had a torque characteristic that rewarded smooth, consistent throttle management and penalized the kind of aggressive throttle work that younger operators tended to use. The 4020 was the most versatile of the 3 and the one that most closely approximated what a modern utility tractor could do, and running it alongside the other 2 gave Tobias a reference point that helped him understand what the engineering of each decade had been trying to solve and what it had sacrificed in the process. Silas watched from the same distance Emmett had maintained, which was close enough to be available and far enough to be respectful. He answered questions when asked and did not offer opinions when not asked, which was harder than it sounds when you have been farming the same ground for 38 years and have opinions about most of what you see. Helen told him once that watching him not give advice was like watching a man not scratch a mosquito bite, and Silas said that was about right. By 2021, Tobias had expanded to 80 acres, had paid off the small operating loan he had taken from the Hardin County State Bank for his first season's inputs, and had bought a used planter of his own, a 6-row unit from the 1990s that he had rebuilt over the winter with a thoroughness that the dealer in Iowa Falls, when he heard about it, said was better than what most people did with new equipment. He was 22 years old. The parallels were not lost on anyone who knew both stories. Let me tell you about the morning in June of 2022 that most people in Eldora who were paying attention consider the moment the story became fully visible. There was a machinery auction at a farm north of town, the kind of auction that happens when an older farmer retires and the equipment goes to whoever needs it, and half the county shows up because half the county needs something and the other half is curious. Silas was there because he was always at auctions. Tobias was there because he was looking at a grain cart that was in reasonable condition and within his budget. And a man named Dale Crowley was there, who had been the John Deere dealer in Iowa Falls for 22 years, and who had a long memory and a particular relationship with the story of Silas Bontrager that was worth understanding. Dale Crowley had been the one, in 1997, who had told a reporter from the Eldora Hardin County Index that the story of Silas Bontrager was a good human interest story, but that the economics of starting a farm operation with used equipment from the 1960s were not something he would recommend to anyone serious about modern agriculture. He had not said this to be cruel. He had said it because he believed it, and because he had spent 22 years selling modern equipment and had a commercial interest in the proposition that new was better than old, and because Silas Bontrager's operation, while admirable in its origins, had long since transitioned to modern equipment, and therefore did not, in Dale Crowley's view, constitute evidence for anything except the value of eventually buying new. He was not a bad man. He was a man whose professional identity was organized around a particular set of beliefs about equipment, and those beliefs did not have much room in them for the idea that a 1962 tractor given to a boy with $11 had been the foundation of an 800-acre operation. At the auction, Dale Crowley saw Tobias Marquez examining the grain cart and asked someone nearby who he was, and the someone told him, and Dale looked at Tobias for a moment and then looked at Silas, who was standing 30 feet away looking at a set of field cultivator shovels, and something in the geometry of the two of them standing in that field connected in Dale's mind in a way that made him quiet for a moment. He walked over to Silas and said, "Is that the Marquez kid I've been hearing about?" Silas said yes. Dale said, "The one you gave the tractors to?" Silas said yes. Dale looked at Tobias again and said, "Those are some old machines to be starting with." Silas looked at Dale for a moment with an expression that was not unfriendly but was not warm either, and said, "They were good enough for me." Dale Crowley did not have a response to that. He stood there for a moment and then he said, "I suppose they were," and walked away. And that was as close as Dale Crowley ever came to acknowledging publicly what Emmett Hassel had understood in 1979 and what Silas Bontrager had understood in 2018, and what the 1962 John Deere 4010 had been demonstrating for 60 years, which was that the value of a machine is not its age or its price, or the name on the dealership sign, but what it teaches the person operating it and what that person does with what they've learned. Let me tell you about the fall of 2023, because it is the most recent chapter of this story and the one that closes the shape of it in a way that I think Emmett Hassel would have recognized. Tobias Marquez was 24 years old and farming 120 acres, which was not large by Hardin County standards, but was solid and growing and managed with the precision that people who watched it closely found impressive. He had hired a part-time employee for the harvest season, a 16-year-old from Eldora named Marcus Webb, who was Lorraine Webb's grandson, which is the kind of detail that rural Iowa produces regularly, and that I mention because it is true and because it matters in the way that all such connections matter in small places. Marcus had come to Tobias the way Tobias had come to Silas, and Silas had come to Emmett, which is to say, through a chain of people who paid attention to young people who needed something to hold on to. Tobias had put Marcus on the 401 first, not because it was the most capable machine or the most efficient, but because it was the one that taught patience, and because Tobias had learned that patience was the first thing and the most important thing and the thing that everything else depended on. Marcus had struggled with it at first, the way anyone struggles with a machine that doesn't respond the way modern equipment responds, and Tobias had stood next to him and said the same thing Silas had said to him, which was that the tractor was not being difficult. It was being honest. It was showing you exactly what you were doing wrong, and if you paid attention to what it was showing you, you would learn something that the newer machines would hide from you because they were designed to correct your mistakes before you noticed them. Marcus had looked at him and said, "How do you know all this?" And Tobias had said, "Someone showed me." Silas Bontrager, in the fall of 2023, was 61 years old, which was the age Emmett Hassel had been in 1979 when he signed over the title to the 4010 in the gravel driveway. He had not planned this symmetry. It had arrived on its own, the way the meaningful symmetries in a life usually do, quietly and without announcement, and you only see them when you stop and look at the shape of things. He was still farming, still working alongside Aaron, still driving the 8370R during planting and harvest, and still, when the occasion called for it, driving the 4010 for the smaller jobs, because he was not capable of not driving it, and because he did not want to be. Helen had pointed out the symmetry of the ages to him one evening in September, and Silas had sat with it for a while and then said, "I know." She had asked him what he thought about it, and he had said, "I think Emmett knew what he was doing." She had said, "I think he did too." The 1962 John Deere 4010 was now 61 years old. It had been maintained through 3 different stewardships, Emmett's and Silas's and now Tobias's partial custody, and it ran with the same fundamental reliability it had run with in 1962, because the things that had been built into it in the factory in Waterloo, Iowa, in the early 1960s, the quality of the castings, the simplicity of the hydraulic circuit, the accessibility of every component that needed regular attention, had been designed by people who expected the machine to last, and it had lasted because the people who owned it had expected it to last and had treated it accordingly. It was not a museum piece. It was a working machine. It would be a working machine for as long as there was someone willing to do what needed to be done to keep it that way. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the thing this story is actually about, underneath the tractors and the titles and the gravel driveways. Emmett Hassel farmed 480 acres in Hardin County for 38 years, and raised one daughter who moved to Cedar Rapids and had a good life and never farmed. By the conventional measure of agricultural legacy, which is land and family continuity, Emmett's legacy ended when Patricia sold the farm after his stroke in 1997. But Emmett had understood something about legacy that the conventional measure misses, which is that it does not travel only through blood. It travels through attention. It travels through the willingness to see something in a person that the person cannot yet see in themselves, and to give them the tool that makes the potential real, and to ask nothing back except that they do the same thing when the time comes. Silas Bontrager had 800 acres and 3 sons and a 2015 combine that cost more than most houses in Eldora. By the conventional measure, his legacy was secure. But the thing he was most certain about, in the fall of 2023, at 61 years old, was not the 800 acres or the combine or the precision planting system. It was Tobias Marquez on 120 acres with 3 old tractors and a 16-year-old named Marcus Webb learning patience on a 1962 John Deere 4010 in a field east of Eldora, Iowa. That was the thing. That was the whole thing. Emmett Hassel gave 1 tractor to a boy with nothing in September of 1979. The boy farmed with it for 39 years, and then gave it and 2 more to another boy with nothing in October of 2018. That boy is farming with them now. He has a 16-year-old on the oldest one, teaching him what patience looks like when it's built into metal. The chain has not broken. The machine is still running. And somewhere in that fact, if you look at it long enough, is everything Emmett Hassel ever believed about what the ground asks of you and what you owe the next person who needs to learn it. Some things don't become obsolete. They just wait for the right hands to find them again. And sometimes the right hands belong to someone who has nothing else to hold on to, and the someone who gives them the thing understands that what they're really given is not the machine but the chance to become the kind of person who will someday give it to someone else. Emmett understood that. Silas understood that. Tobias Marquez, 24 years old and farming 120 acres in Hardin County, Iowa, with a 16-year-old learning patience on a 61-year-old tractor, is beginning to understand it too. And Marcus Webb, 16 years old and sitting on that machine right now, feeling the hydraulics respond to his hands, learning to listen to what the tractor is telling him instead of fighting it, will understand it someday in a gravel driveway somewhere, holding a title out to someone who has nothing, saying the same 4 words that have traveled now through 3 pairs of hands across 44 years of Hardin County ground. Because you're going to need it. That's what happens when a man sees not junk but the whole shape of a life in something everyone else has already.